if you have a Bible and you find it helpful, we're going to start a series in the book of Romans, Paul's letter to the church in Rome. And we're going to begin today with what I'm going to call a first installment, which really is going to open the door here into Paul's writings. Paul's letter to the church at Rome is a different letter from the other ones. Most of the other letters address specific problems within church congregations. And we're glad to have those because we need them. Problems haven't really changed much simply because people are the same. I contend that history doesn't change us at all. The basic building block of humanity is the same as it always has been. He's not writing to a specific problem here. He's really giving a more general theological treatment. And we have to see the method. The method, and we'll look at that in some further installments more in detail. The method of Paul's writing of this letter is very important because it displays the miraculous nature of this, that God, the Spirit of God, was so much alive in Paul, the apostle, that Paul was able to dictate this letter in the way that he does. This letter is not something where you have Paul sitting over a writing desk with a lamp burning and he's poring over every sentence to make sure he gets all the structure right, choosing words very carefully and scratching one word out and putting another one in. No. This is all a stream of thought coming from Paul to his secretary Tertius, who is writing this down, which makes this all the more miraculous. How much redaction took place between Paul's delivery and Tertius's writing of it, I don't know. I'm going to say probably not very much. Let's look at the text. I'll begin reading in verse 1. Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated to the gospel of God, which God promised before through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who was born of the seed of David according to the flesh and declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. Through him we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith among all the nations for his name, among whom you also are the called of Jesus Christ. To all who are in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers, making request if by some means now at last I may find a way in the will of God to come to you. For I long to see you, that I might impart to you some spiritual gift, so that you'll be more established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you by the mutual faith, both yours and mine. What is the purpose for this letter? I think in order to really begin as a first installment, it would be good to see what the purpose is. Now, clearly, Paul's purpose in this opening is to win his hearers or his readers. And there are good reasons for that. Paul was known in Rome, but we don't have any record that he ever went there. So far as we know, Paul never made it to Rome in a visit. And he is writing this letter to explain not only his apostleship, he's also explaining his heart toward this church and also his theology. But there would have been mixed feelings in Rome. So Paul is very careful here to come underneath this congregation because he realizes that this Gentile congregation would have members within it who knew Saul of Tarsus, but not Paul the apostle. And so there might have been some suspicion. This is only 58 A.D. We think that Paul's conversion was somewhere around 33 to 35, somewhere in that range. And that by 35 he had already encountered the apostles in Galatia. So this writing around 58 AD is not far removed from that. And you have to realize, of course, there's no mass communication in the Roman Empire. So the news wouldn't travel that quickly to Rome, that Paul was safe. He's one of us now. They might not have known. So Paul is not arrested. He's probably writing this letter from Corinth, and he's trying to get to Spain westward, which is where he saw his mission taking him. and Rome would have made a great place to have a headquarters. There were good reasons to go to Spain. I think of one specifically. You had Seneca, the great Roman Stoic philosopher who resided there. Boy, what would it have meant for Spain and the rest of the Roman Empire if Seneca had become a believer? What if he'd been reached? Paul had not yet gotten to Jerusalem, which of course is where the mother church is, and his arrest. So the occasion, of course, for the visit to Jerusalem, if you go to Romans chapter 15, his desire to go there is to bring aid for that church, because the Jerusalem church was a highly persecuted church. They were persecuted by the Romans. They were also persecuted by the Jews. And being in Jerusalem was an easy place to be persecuted. So they were catching it from both sides. So Paul was trying to take something to them for help, because a lot of the Jewish believers in Jerusalem had lost everything to follow Jesus. A lot different from you and me. We take on Christianity as a kind of a new coat, or a warm coat on a cool day that we can slip on and off as need be. For the people in Jerusalem at that time in history, when they became Christians, they had to turn their back on their life, literally. So Paul wanted to go to Jerusalem and help them. Now, there are some scholarly problems with the letter to the Romans, and I don't want to make a big deal out of this because I don't think it is one. I think the question of Romans chapter 16 is easily answerable by some of the practical ramifications of that particular time in history, but I want to spend just a minute looking at that, so that if you ever pick up a book and somebody makes mention of this, you won't be surprised by it, that you'll be acquainted with it in some way. Some scholars question whether chapter 16 was ever a part of the letter to Rome, and they do so on the basis that Paul drops names who would have been really more associated with Ephesus, which is the place where Paul spent more time as an apostle than he spent anywhere else. The personal greetings that he sends in chapter 16 are to people who would have been banished from Rome in 52 AD by the Emperor Claudius. Very significant. Priscilla and Aquila being two of them. Now, I'm going to say that might be possible. It might be that chapter 16 was some addendum put in by somebody else. That's possible, but I don't think so. What seems more likely is that you've got a 6-year period from the time of Claudius's expulsion of the Jews from Rome. They didn't like the Jews. The Jews were troublesome to them. There had been some infraction. The Jews were expelled. They'd had enough of them and their monotheism, and they were so easily in the Roman mind offended by anything that had to do with their temple or idols or burning incense to Caesar or any of that they got tired of them to a great degree. Nothing has changed, has it, in all this time of history passage. But Priscilla and Aquila and the others who were expelled in 52, this is 6 years later when Paul writes this letter. So, given the fact that this is more like the Wild West, people came and went under the radar. There's no surveillance mechanism here, no cell phones, no cameras. So these people could have easily in 6 years after being expelled from Rome, trickled back in. They could have trickled back in and come back to their business. You see, when they were expelled, whatever they were doing there in Rome, they had to leave it all behind. They were just kicked out. None of your stuff, you couldn't haul the house, and whatever you can take on your back is yours, but otherwise you're just out of here. We're removing you from this city. I would say that in 6 years that was sufficient time for these people to be back. So what we've got here is the more probable explanation is that there were two Roman letters. One was the letter written to the Roman church specifically. The other is the one that was circulated. And the reason I say that is you have to realize in 58 AD, inscripturation of the epistles has not taken place. There's no scriptural transmission here, such as there was with the Masoretes in the Old Testament, carefully making sure to not make any mistakes. Yes, there were copies being circulated, but those copies were just written down, probably hastily, and they were circulated to the other churches just for their benefit. Nobody was thinking to themselves, oh, we got to be careful, we're writing scripture here. So, the two forms was probably a likely explanation. Whoever copied Paul's letter probably didn't bother about chapter 16 because they looked at it and said, well, these are people that don't even live here anymore. And so it doesn't matter. Let's not worry about sending that part out in the copies. And that's probably what happened. But it's no big deal because it doesn't change anything about the meat of the letter. Some of these specific historical items where Paul says, bring the cloak I left at Troas, they don't apply to us anyway. They're just there because these are letters. Now, the genius of Paul is the way in which he approaches this church who really doesn't know him. They don't really know Paul. He's never been there. You have to keep that in mind. He opens up the second part of his pericope, his text here, with a compliment for the congregation. You're known all over the world. Your faith is known. He is showing his heart as an apostle, a pastor's heart. He is encouraging this congregation in their walk with the Lord. And this is important because there probably were some suspicions about Paul still extant in this church. Is this Paul, the apostle, or is this Saul, the persecutor? There would be people in this congregation where it's only 58 AD. Paul, as I have pointed out in other times, probably converted around 32 or 33, 2 or 3 years after the crucifixion. And then he's connected with some of the apostles in Galatia by 35 AD to check out what he's now giving as the gospel with what they were giving as the gospel. This is only 23 years, 23, 24 years later. There would be easily people in this congregation who would still associate Paul with Saul, the persecutor. Is he coming to get us? Can we trust him? So Paul is writing this to allay all of those fears, to set them aside, to let the people know, I am an apostle called of Jesus. And all of the language that he uses as he encourages this church is that of a warm heart. He's trying his best to warm himself and to warm them toward him, to win them. Now he gives his credentials and he calls himself a very specific term. He says doulos, doulos. That's the Greek word meaning slave. That's what it means. Why would he call himself that? Well, there are a couple of reasons. Number one, for the Greek hearer, it would be a way of coming underneath them completely, saying, I am your servant, I'm your slave. For the Jewish hearers who would have been there, it would have been an honorific way of referring to himself by saying, I'm a slave of Yahweh. Because you see in the Old Testament, that was a kind of a tradition. Moses and Jeremiah and Isaiah, Joshua, they were all doulos in this sense of being slaves of Yahweh. So it had that sense of honor for the Jewish hearer. For the Greek hearer, it would have been a way of coming underneath them. This is a genius letter when you realize he's just spouting this off the top of his head. He uses another word here, aphorizo, which is the term that would mean set apart, set apart. Now this being set apart, you have to realize that the Pharisees thought themselves to be set apart. Now I guarantee you, Jewish hearers and Greek hearers would have understood this term in very different ways. The Greek hearer would have heard it as somebody called out to do something very specific. The Jewish hearer would have heard Pharisee, and they weren't far off the mark. Paul, what does he say of himself to the church at Philippi? Pharisee of the Pharisees, born to the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day and before the law, blameless. I mean, he was top notch when it came to being a Pharisee. A Pharisee in Jesus' time and in the time of Paul's writing here would not allow a common person to even touch the fringe of their cloak. And so for Paul to be set apart for the Jewish hearer and for the Greek hearer to hear him set apart in the way that he is as an apostle, this would have been just shocking to the Jewish reader. You mean Paul is set apart to bring the gospel to the pigs? That's the way it would have been seen. I mean, one of the phrases used by the Pharisees toward the Gentiles was they were fuel for the fires of hell. Now think of that. Paul is set apart to bring the gospel to those very people whom the Pharisees thought to be the fuel for the fires of hell. And he centers his call on two specific things. He says Jesus has come in the flesh. That's the incarnation. Son of David, fulfiller of the prophecies, Son of Yahweh himself, God with us, Emmanuel. That's all great. He makes that declaration in the text. But then he makes another declaration, and this is the most startling thing for me. Paul anchors the gospel where the whole of the Bible anchors the gospel, in a time and space historical event. He says Jesus is declared Son of God by what? Resurrection. The word declared is, Jesus is horizo. Do you know what that word is? It's the word from which we get our word horizon. And in this context, it's a way of saying he is declared, he is horizo, he is the dividing line in all of history. The entirety of history in all of humanity prior and all of humanity post is centered on this event where God himself has entered in to humanhood. The boundary of earth and heaven was marked off by the resurrection from the dead. Jesus became the new man. He was raised up in that spiritual body. Read Paul's letter to the church at Corinth in chapter 15. And you read the entire argument there from start to finish, wherein Paul is making that argument for who Jesus is and what the resurrection means. If Jesus is, there's a corollary here, isn't there? This is so fragile. Think of this. He's anchoring the entirety of the faith in this one thing, and it is such a fragile thing. I mean, there could have been all kinds of other claims made. Could have said Jesus rose spiritually from the dead. That would have been unprovable, and people might have believed it. Could have started some kind of minor movement by that, I suppose. There have been lots of movements started on that basis by people who've said they were something special. Could have done that, but they didn't. He was raised from the dead bodily. The tomb was empty, and Jesus was walking around and making appointments with people as he did so. And these people's lives were changed within the matter of just a few weeks by those events. They became not the frightened bunch of fishermen, but the ones who would go out and sell their whole lives out for the cause of Jesus is alive. I mean, that's a big deal. And everything about Judaism for these Jewish boys changed. It's pretty significant, and Paul anchors it in that time and space event. You see, if this is not true, he's saying by corollary, if Jesus is not raised, he is not the Son of God, and none of this matters. I every Easter, when I do an Easter sermon, at some point I will make this case. You get all those hymns about how Jesus is this and Jesus is that. Look, if Jesus didn't come back from the tomb, none of it means anything. He's just another figure of history, said some neat stuff in the Sermon on the Plain, the Sermon on the Mount. That's great, but I don't have to pay any attention to it because none of it matters. But if he came back from the tomb, all of it matters. It's incredible what Paul is doing here. Paul uses a word here, charis, grace. His charge, grace and peace. He is linking east and west. Grace would have been the Greek understanding, the East. That would have been the way that the Greek mind would have responded to that, charis, grace. And then he links it up with shalom, peace. The Jewish mind would have understood that. East and West tied together. Paul, I'm telling you, the more we dig into this letter, the way Paul chooses words here is absolutely, you have to say, supernatural. Paul, as the writer of most of our New Testament, is kind of a luminary in our thinking. But in his mind, he is doulos, slave before God. Boy, I look at that and I think to myself, how the church would be changed. How the church would be changed to this day, right now, if people who have risen to great recognition in the faith would see themselves as service people, servants, just given a task instead of given a title. That would mean something, wouldn't it? I don't know about you. I've been in many church settings, and I've been around pastors and teachers who thought themselves something. And while I might receive something from them, it's awfully hard. I have to cut through a lot of fog to get there. But what if everybody who feels themselves called to do anything in this world for the sake of the gospel would see their calling as a service and a task given to them by God instead of a title? I can only imagine. How much of our freedom as believers do we forfeit for the prestige of some kind of title? Deacon so-and-so and elder so-and-so and pastor so-and-so, as though those titles mean anything. Slave was good enough for the Apostle Paul, right? The question for us is, and it was toward the Gentiles to whom it was good enough, that he would come underneath them. The question for you and me is the title doulos, slave, good enough for you and me? I don't know where everybody is. If there's anything about which I've said today, you have a question, you want to talk to me about joining this church, I'll stay as long as it takes.